Thanks everyone for having us. We're completely honored to be a part of this panel and this conference. I'm Annie, this is Nathaniel, and we are the co-owners of Deep Harvest Farm and Seeds on Whidbey Island in the lovely Puget Sound, about 40 minutes north of Seattle. In 2011, we started a mixed veg operation, a small CSA, and selling at farmers market. We continued that model until about 2014 when we started growing seeds on contract and started our own small retail seed business, just with a couple of racks nearby. Now we have a 10-acre farm on which we grow about 3.5 acres of mixed veggies, and we also grow about 1.5 acres of seed crops, some on our home farm and then some on 2 isolation plots that we lease from nearby landowners. We have 2 full-time employees and a seed intern, and the 2 of us that are working on all of this kind of April through December. And then we have about 1 to 2 days of help December through March, working on our seed packing side of our business. April through December, we run 115-person veggie CSA, 115 families, and we also sell veggies retail to restaurants and grocery stores. And then for our seed side of our business, we sell at about 18 regional nurseries and through our online seed store. We offer 120 varieties of seed crops, most of which we grow ourselves, but this past year we started contracting with other regional growers who grew about 12 crops for our seed catalog, things that we couldn't grow very easily or well here on our home farm, maybe due to heat or space. So that has been an exciting addition to our operation here. So that's kind of our basic breakdown. It's a lot of moving pieces, often quite scattered, but keeps our brain sharp. And we have a lot of fun with the diversity of it all, and are grateful to be really well supported in our community for our veg operation and on the seed front. We kind of have been able to grow our business little by little almost every year. So with a huge jump, thanks to increased seed sales during COVID times, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So yeah, here's a picture of one of our seed racks. We have some racks that hold 42 varieties and other racks that hold 84. And this is just one of our nurseries. And then just the last slide that you can switch to is just one of our seed isolation plots. So that kind of gives you a small visual of what we got going, and that's us. So thanks.
Perfect, thank you. Up next is Adrianna.
Hey, Adrianna, we can't hear you yet.
Can you see my slides now?
Yes, we can see your slides. Go into present view and we can hear your voice, see your face.
Okay.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you for your grace. My name is Adrianna. I'm half of Empowered Flowers. We're actually 3, but we have a rotating 3rd person. We're based out of Kampe in Oregon City, and that's in Oregon. We're just 20 minutes outside of the Portland area. We started farming for ourselves in 2019. In 2020, after attending the Seed Growers Conference, we started doing seed contracts. So that's kind of how we got into it. I have experience with growing seeds and learning about growing seeds through my biggest seed mentor, which is Frank Morton at Wild Garden Seed, and Michaela at OSA. So I'm eternally grateful to them and to this conference for allowing us to get into seed, because seed is definitely one of my bigger passions. Yeah, this is my wife and I. Some like a little market display, and then that was my first packing seed and sending it away on contract. I was just delighted there. So we lease land, which has been really great for us because it has created isolations. These are two of the separate locations that we have. One is in Kampe and one is in Oregon City. We have about 3 acres of production for vegetables, specifically for market. And that number has ranged from being 1.5 acres up to 3 acres. And also the amount of seed that we've grown has changed from like 1/4 acre up to as much as 1/2 acre, which is what we did last year. Seed for us has ranged in terms of what our gross income of it is, but still we derive the majority of our income from direct to consumer vegetable sales. And then we do about 10 to 20% in seed contracts. This is us in our seed plot last year. We did a lot of flowers and some lettuces. Yeah, we did chicories. We've done probably about 12 different species in a year. This is actually last year we had a seed intern through the OSA program. And so this is us sort of getting our hands dirty and cleaning a bunch of seed on contract. It was so great to have that help and support. This was us during the fires, cleaning seed and trying to pack it so that we could evacuate in time. So seed is kind of a big priority for us. We can step away from markets and do stuff like that, but seed is kind of like a longer journey, so it's pretty important to us. And cucumbers is like our flagship. I feel like it was the first seed contract that we got, and it's something that we continue to grow and do every year. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to tell y'all about our farm.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And now we will pivot to Eric.
Howdy, everyone. Guess I'll wait. Is that gonna get bigger? I guess we can work with it at any size. Anyway, I'll just go on. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Eric Kampe. I've been doing seed and produce work for about 15 years, and I was hoping to share, I guess, my experiences from sort of 3 different farm flavors. And that's, my rookie years were at Abundanza outside of Boulder, Colorado. And then I started my own farm called Ann Arbor Seed Company. This is in Michigan. And then most recently, I've been working with the Green Things Farm Collective, which is a group of 5 of us that run a diversified farm. So the next slide will show some of my time at Abo. That looks strange. If y'all are seeing the same thing I'm seeing, there it is. And so, like I said, this was sort of my rookie seed years. This is where I got to learn how beautiful and I don't know, heartwarming seed work can be. It was big for a small farm. It was about 10 to 15 acres of produce and seed. We were doing direct pack sales, as you can see in this farmer's market picture. We were also growing seed on contract for Seeds of Change. I wasn't involved in the books, but I'm guessing between 10 and 15% of our revenue was from seed at that time. The next slide is I started my own very small farm business, Ann Arbor Seed Company. This started in 2012. It was a 3/4 acre piece of land. My original intention was to do 100% seed. This was all direct marketed pack sales. And so that would be farmers market, retailer relations, and website sales. But over the years, I started growing produce there as well. And it was probably about 60-40 seeds produce by 2019. And then most recently, I was a member of the Green Things Farm Collective. And so here's the 5 of us that ran that operation. We did about 4 acres very intensively of produce and seed, as well as some protected space. We had about 100 acres of land, but there was some cattle grazing, hay, and woodland. And about 5 to 15% of that revenue was seed. And then just sort of last, on kind of a real note, in all of that time, I was never able to make a living wage as a seed and produce grower. And so I'm exploring other options as I go forward, but I didn't want to ignore that point in this presentation. Thank you.
That's great. So now we know a little bit about all of our panelists, and we can move into having some discussion about the questions that we all identified as a group when we were thinking about what we felt folks really need to know about seed production on vegetable farms. So we had talked about starting with a discussion of the pros and cons of doing a mixed seed vegetable operation. And the one thing I wrote down in my notes was who's starting each of these pieces, but I'm guessing that the folks that are kicking it off probably know who they are. So who was starting this one?
What is the first topic?
The
That would be Adrianna.
Oh yeah, that's me. Yeah, so I had pros and cons of running a seed and veggie farm simultaneously. And I have a little slide, so if I could share it, that would, I'm gonna do a screen share again. Can everyone see it?
You're still in a funny view. There we go. Now it's coming on. Looks perfect.
So yeah, my wife had been farming for 28 years before we started our own business. And so when we went into it, my intention was always to get into seed. She had experience working alongside a seed farm from where we had worked previously. We had worked alongside wild garden seed. So I think a lot of the pros and cons, I set them up as pros and cons, but they fall on both sides. Like specifically the irrigation and layout, it requires planning and intention. And you could think of that as a con because you have to really have a plan, or you could think of that as a pro because you're going into a season and you know exactly where you're planting stuff, you know where what type of irrigation you're using. You can really take the time to do that. In terms of disease introduction, I don't know that that can fall into the pro category, but we've definitely had some disease introduction from overwintering brassica crops for seed production, and had that sort of impact our market growing capacities. Isolation requirements are another big thing that we need to take into consideration because we do seed contracts. We either need to have more isolations or this goes back to sort of like the planning and intention of it all. If we don't have the isolation, then we either can't grow it for market or we can't grow it for seed. So they, in some ways, they can sort of be mutually exclusive to each other, and that's a real limitation, I think, if you're trying to do both simultaneously. Infrastructure investments have been something to work with. I attended the equipment session that was, I think, a couple of days ago. We've bought lots of screens and we have a window wizard, but also some of the infrastructure investments were things that we needed for our market farm. So this is another one of the ones that can fall into the pros and cons. There's things that you can use for market gardening that we use for processing seeds, specifically like our greenhouses, which we have heat tables on for germinating. We use those to dry seed and as like a safe place to keep seed when we're like drying it, processing it, going through all of it. We also have lots of market totes, and we use those for keeping all of our seed in. So it's an investment we have made once, but we use for 2 separate businesses. And this is the next point of, you know, there being a longer period between growing seed to receiving seed income, I think also falls in the pros and cons. It creates financial resiliency for our farm. We have income in the wintertime when we are down to one market, when our income stream has been reduced by half usually. And so it kind of feels like this longer game to income, but also it creates like winter income. So that's been really important to our farm. And I feel like I want to hear from Nathaniel and Annie about this, but direct to consumer sales to me strike me as like this very complex system that I'm hesitant to engage with, whereas going to market and selling direct to consumer veggies feels like a really easy thing to sort of step into and just be in. So I feel like, again, to me, that's can fall into either pro or con. If you're a systems person, then it might be a pro. And if you're not, then it might be a con. But the biggest things that we love about it is it creates a diversity in the field, in the pests, in the work, in the workflow, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later. And that's like really important to us. And it's our passion. So it expands the way that we think about growing. It expands our knowledge base about being growers. It increases our practical skills as growers. It grows us as farmers. And for that, we're always thankful. Yeah, I feel like maybe that's all I had to say, but I think the biggest or like the top pro that I have of one crop being able to fulfill 2 purposes is continually something that it's like when you're roguing and when you're removing plants and you can be using those to go to market, that's a great benefit. We've also discovered new varieties by growing them on contract for people that we feel like, oh, this fits a new window. And this is a great opportunity for us to like expand our window into, let's say, broccoli rabe, because that's what happened for us last year. And now we have this new variety, and this goes back to the whole expanding our knowledge base, increasing our observational skills, and growing as growers. So for us, it's feel like the pros outweigh the cons. And it's been really beneficial to us as growers and as a business. Yeah.
We could add a few pros and cons if appropriate. Another thing that I like about growing seed and veggies, especially having a CSA farm and a seed business, is we do a market style CSA where we interact with our customers every time they come and pick up their veggies. And every time we see our CSA members, we get instant feedback about varieties that they like or don't like. And I feel like we have a weekly survey of crops that could be worth adding to our seed catalog or worthy of forgetting about. So that's helpful, just to know what people are liking out there in the world. It really contributes to what we're going to prioritize. And one other thing that I have really appreciated about a pro seed business combined with veggie business is just the diversity of income streams, which then creates a little more farm resilience for us. In the last few years, there have been a huge addition of especially farmers market growers here on the island. And the fact that we sell to restaurants, sell to grocery stores, have a seed company, sell online, and do all of these things kind of allows us to be a little more flexible and realize, we don't have to keep forcing it at farmers market. We're covered there in our community, and we can really prioritize our CSA and keep growing our seed business. And it just allows us a little more resilience, which has been really valuable. And Nathaniel, I had a little more to say.
Yeah, there's so many amazing synergies and items in the pro column. I'll just mention a couple more potential pitfalls or cons of doing both. I would say August and September can get a little nutty if you're doing a lot of mixed veg and also a good number of seed contracts. Generally, that is when the crops are ready to harvest and pull out of the field. It's also when your veggie crops are peaking and you have those, 10, 12-hour harvest days, and there's only so many people on your crew and so many hours during the day, and you can get into some triaging situations pretty easily if you're not well resourced. If there's a rainy day coming and you have to get that dry seeded crop out of the field ASAP, but it's also a harvest day and you have $3,000 of vegetables that you have to get to market the next day, it can get a little stressful. So August and September, you just kind of have to go in with eyes wide open and be ready for some potentially stressful days and kind of plan out your days maybe a little ahead of time and use some foresight, especially when it comes to the seed crops and what they're going to need in the upcoming days and weeks ahead. If you are a person that can get easily overwhelmed with lots of competing priorities, which is farming in a nutshell, but it adds especially farming seed and vegetables, it's just something to think about if you're going to add a lot of extra seed crops on your farm on top of a vegetable operation. I would recommend it. It's a lot of fun, but yeah, August and September can get a little wild. The other thing is if you're doing retail seed packets or seed packets in general, retail or wholesale, it's you don't really get an off season. So one great thing about farming vegetables is there generally is an off season, but we have found that is slowly disappearing every year more and more for us as we get more into seed packets. I'll leave it at that. Hand it over to Eric.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate everything all of you all have shared. Couple of thoughts I would add is just from promoting the produce side of our operation, doing some seed work has been really lovely. So we can talk to our market customers, we can talk to our CSA members. When we have folks over for a farm tour, they're always very excited to learn about the seed side of the business and like, oh, this arugula you grow is so beautiful and it's from your own seed. That's, it's very heartwarming. It's a lovely part of the story. I would also say from a practical standpoint, doing both produce and seeds helps with some of the challenges with seed saving. Being an expert in the produce that you want to save seed in is like a prerequisite. But also things like I believe Adrianna mentioned what I call thin to win, when you're growing a produce crop and you're harvesting and roguing it down to your seed spacing. That can work really well with greens. But then there's also sometimes with your seed crop, you want a larger population for genetic diversity than you might want to grow like for that seed crop. And so for instance, like if you have a zucchini or something and the produce part of your operation can let you grow, more plants, even if you only want to save seed off of a smaller set. And so then that population has a greater diversity, which I've found helpful at times. On the con side, we could go on, but it's more a complexity issue that I've found. When I was younger, I used to think I was really smart, and seed and farming in general has shown me that the weakest link is right up top here. And so just being organized and keeping everything in its right path, there is another layer of complexity, particularly when I've worked on operations that it wasn't just me dictating from on high, as if that's a thing. When I have other owners involved that might go off and do some wonderful thing that wasn't exactly as I had considered it for the seed work, that complexity and communication can be real. I'll leave it at that.
That was great. I just want to make sure I circle back and see if any of the comments brought anything up for any of the rest of our panel, but if not, then we can go ahead and keep moving.
I think we can also do a question and answer. If there are clarifying comments, I'll keep an eye on that in the chat, but otherwise we can save questions for Q&A at the end.
Right, like the question about isolation, we can definitely cover in a different section.
Yeah.
We'll get.
So I think I'm gonna launch us into talking about kind of the spatial dynamics of running both seed and vegetables on your farm, as well as kind of isolation considerations and needs. Like Eric, it is just kind of another layer of complexity to overlay on an already complex dynamic system. You're thinking about your plant families and your crop rotation. You're thinking about your soil moisture. You're thinking about the seasonality of where things need to go and the location, you know, the distance from your pack shed, and then whether it's seed or vegetables is just kind of another layer to overlay onto that. And we like to clump all of our seed crops together as much as possible because they have a specific set of needs that vegetables do not. They are all on drip, regardless of whether they're fruiting, rooting, dry seeded, wet seeded crop. We keep all of our seed crops on drip, and I'm sure you guys understand why, for disease reasons and moisture reasons on the actual seed and the pods and fruits themselves. So they also are generally in the field for a long time, whereas a radish might, for vegetables, for your first spring succession, might just be 30 to 50 days. The radish seed crop is in there, 5-6 months. And so they are generally all full season crops, any seed crop that you're going to go. So blocking that all together is really handy, just as far as your field layout, your planning, knowing how long, how many months a certain block is going to be in cultivation. In our early years, we were scrambling a lot more. We try to squeeze a seed crop in within a vegetable plot, and then 2 months, 3 months later, we'd have harvest all the surrounding vegetables, and there'd be this one bed of arugula seed or broccoli seeds kind of in the middle of the field, just causing problems, making it hard to cover crop that area, making it hard to irrigate in the cover crop seed, and to just kind of turn over that field so we can get the next rotation in. So there's a lot of just kind of sticking points if you throw in seed crops kind of willy-nilly around your farm, wherever you find space and time. We also like to keep them together just for kind of mental organization, so we can kind of communicate to our crew and our employees about what field they're working in. It can be a little confusing if there's a pea seed crop in with your food seed crop or your food peas in, and you can have volunteers or coworkers starting picking your seed crops for vegetables, and that's kind of the worst the worst outcome you could hope for. So kind of as much space and mentally and physically as you can put between your seed and vegetable crops, it'll just create a much more kind of like calm flowing season for you. We like to block all of our brassica seed crops. We kind of have two general blocks. We have our brassicas and our non-brassicas. For our vegetable operation, about half of our fresh vegetable crops are brassicas. They take about half of our cultivated field space. And it's a little less with our seed crops as far as the percent brassicas, but they still make a huge block of our seed crops that we grow every year. And we like to keep those together. And we generally block them in with like our spring brassica vegetable block. There'll be a spring seed brassica block, and then our spring vegetables brassicas. That way we can keep the plant families moving together, but also the seeds are still together and they can stay on drip together and stay in the field longer. And same with our non-brassicas. We'll block all those together within our spring kind of non-brassica field block for vegetables. Yeah, oh yeah, we have pictures. Sorry, I meant to be sharing the screen. Let's see. Oh, share screen. Oh, I need to plus share screen. Let's. Oops, sorry, my bad. Can you all see that? Okay, so we grow, as far as kind of thinking spatially about isolation needs on your farm. Oh, one more thing I'll say before we talk about isolation is thinking about cover cropping. Growing seed crops can be not super compatible with cover cropping sometimes if you're growing seed kind of in the same field every year without a longer term rotation plan. Because they take up the full year, it's hard to squeeze in like a buckwheat kind of crop in the middle of the season, or even have time to fit in like a nice rye vetch at the end of the season, just because we generally have to get in early to get these seed crops in the ground in March and April, which doesn't really allow a whole lot of time to allow an overwintering cover crop to mature to get that organic matter or nitrogen that you really want. So what we do generally, if we have a plot that's purely seed, like this isolation plot here that we're growing seed on every year, what we'll try to do is try to get maybe an August or September, like oats, peas cover crop in here that'll winter kill on their own. And then we can get in early the next year without having to deal with a lot of organic matter to incorporate. The other thing, which is nice about seeds, is in theory, you should be able to make more per square foot on a seed crop than you can on a vegetable crop. If you're limited on space, that could mean if you're planful about your spacing, you could hopefully over time, as you switch to seed crops, use less space on your farm and then allow more options for longer term rotations. So you don't have to be planting every bed every year. If you can plant seed crops on it every other year, that gives you an entire year-long window to do a semi-perennial cover crop, or at least like a nice, good long spring cover crop to replenish that soil. Whereas with vegetables that you need to kind of plant every year in order to make that profit margin, it might not be possible, because this seed crop should have a higher profit margin if you're doing it right and you're getting the right price from the seed company, or if you're selling retail packets. Here's just a couple more seed isolations. Actually, that's the same field, just looks like a few weeks later. So like I said, we have 2 seed isolations, which allows us to grow 3 varieties of a given species in a given year on our island within 10 miles of our farm. We generally try to put 1 variety per species at each isolation plot per year. The exception is our home farm, where we grow all our vegetables. You can't really grow, the big kind of outlier are the cucurbits. Because they flower before they make their seed, you can't rogue them out, and you can't pull them before they have already crossed with your seed crop. And so we just, as a rule, don't really do any cucurbits on our home farm for seed. We keep those all on our 2 isolation plots. Same with Brassica rapa. And if you do a lot of salad mix or quick greens that are kind of all over the field and always flowering in different stages of maturity, it can be really hard to keep up with the potential cross contamination with your vegetable crops. So kind of as a rule, we don't like to do Brassica rapas, at least close by to our vegetable brassica fields, because of that crossing potential. I have more to say, but I don't want to take up too much time, and so we'll keep moving on.
We have one clarifying question in the
Oh, yeah.
chat, and that is if you could explain quickly what an isolation plot is, that would be helpful.
Sure. So because all of our seed crops need to be isolated in space and time from other flowering crops of the same species in order to keep the genetic purity of the variety, we can't grow a lot of things on our home farm because they would cross with our vegetable crops. Either the fruiting crops that flower before they make the fruit and seed, or things that have kind of gone to flower after you've harvested the vegetable. So therefore we have 2 other plots that we call our isolation plots, which are just separate fields, which are physically isolated from our farm, as well as other surrounding kind of vegetable farms and gardens that could potentially cross with them. And so we've worked out lease arrangements with 2 friends to use those every year.
Perfect, thanks. That was helpful. So we've got a few more minutes on this topic. I'm curious to hear if any of our other panelists want to jump in, discuss your ways of managing this. I know, Adrianna, you've been doing something similar with leasing land and being able to spread out Eric, are you also spreading out onto leased land, or are you able to plan things all on one farm?
Yeah, we definitely had an isolation plot in my front yard in town, which was separate from the farm. And there's been a few different ways that we've done it, but man, I think similar to produce, the isolation plots, we struggled with hitting the same efficiencies for management. There was the main farm where the trucks and the tractors and the bin of compost and all the equipment and all the tools and the crew and the lunch and the break room, yada, yada, yada. And then when you get to your isolation plot, it's like, man, I'm one trowel short, or, or just, not to spend too much time on it, but we really fell in love with the deep mulch method of no-till growing. The disadvantage of that method is it's a lot of heavy material handling. And so for the main farm, we had that dialed in. And then for anything distant, it was very difficult.
Yeah, that's a good point. Brianna, did you have anything else with anything generally with field layout that you wanted to bring up?
I feel like Nathaniel touched on a lot of the bullet points of the pros and cons, and like the intention of it is really like where it starts and where it ends. Like we do everything that for seed on drip irrigation also. And so lining up the drip irrigation spaces so that our overhead isn't getting anything wet when when they're actually flowering or when they're actually setting seed is like continually a challenge. So we do blocks actually mostly by irrigation because we have been leasing 3 different places. The isolation is less of an issue, so we can grow more different species on each isolation plot. But then irrigation is sort of like the limiting factor for us because we do overhead as much as we can for our veg production. But I definitely feel like it's about the intention that you go into it with, how much, and really having a plan, like how much seed do I want to grow versus how much energy do I want to put into my direct to market veggie sales. And I feel like that's a question that I'm consistently asking myself from September till like April, when we're like really done planting out all of our seed crops. And I'm just like, okay, is this really, this is really it? Okay, we're not doing any more seed crops, and that will limit like what we're doing for market also. Yeah, I don't know that I have a big thing to add other than it takes a lot of clear direction. Yeah.
I will add one more thing. Just as far as your spring fields and bed preparation and moisture level in the fields, and kind of a lot of the anxiety that happens around March and April when you're trying to get crops in the ground into wet fields. If you're on a wet, maybe not super well draining site, seed crops need to get in early as well. And so if you have a really early deadline with early spring farmers markets or a CSA customer base that needs those May and June carrots, that you find yourself in direct competition with a lot of seed crops, at least on our farm, that need to get into the ground. So just thinking about the hydrology and the kind of the seasonality of when you can get into your fields is important. It's nice having isolation plots for that as well, not just for the pollination isolation, but also just having more dry space early on in the spring has been really helpful for us, where we can get seed crops just started somewhere else on a sandy soil and kind of focus on our CSA and vegetable needs for our earliest crops here on the farm. Those isolations, like Adrianna said too, if you have 2 or 3 isolations, it's nice to be able to just use those as your rotations as well, maybe growing all of your brassica seeds at one isolation one year, and then to another plot the next year and another plot the next year, and kind of having a built-in 3-year isolation, especially with your more disease-prone crops, is really nice. Some of these, a lot of us are on small diversified farms, and managing disease and insects is kind of seems futile sometimes when there's just not enough space. Anyway, just moving something 50 feet over doesn't necessarily help with a lot of things. So having completely different isolated blocks can be nice for disease management as well.
One other thing about the CSA competition, the CSA and market vegetable competition with our early seed crops getting in, we have really moved our CSA to a later start date. So instead of forcing our CSA to start at the end of April or beginning of May, we now start our CSA the second week of June, which then allows our driest fields to be prioritized for our seed crops. And then, now that we're not racing to market any longer, we have more control of our veggie start dates, which then make these businesses work a little better together instead of competitively. When I was begging for veggie space and Nathaniel was insistent on getting those overwintering crops dealt with. So yeah, there are little things you can do when you have your own business to just make it work for you.
That is super helpful.
Just a note, if members of the audience are more familiar with produce than the seed production, relating to disease in the crops, the spacing requirements for seed crops is usually a lot more than you would for produce. And so since they have a longer life cycle and the plants tend to get much larger, and you need them to sort of remain as healthy as possible for a longer life cycle. So just reminding that point, it might be jarring from a produce point of view. The spacing per plant can be quite a bit more than you might be used to, and that'll help with some disease issue.
Absolutely. So Eric, I'm going to keep you on the hook because we're at the time when we should get to our next topic, and just want to let everyone know that we're continuing to collect the questions that are really awesome, but don't quite fit into the topics yet. And we'll be making sure we have time for those at the end. But before we do that, we'll spend 15 more structured minutes talking a little bit about seasonal workflow and how to manage seed workflow and vegetable workflow. And we'll let Eric explain what's going on here.
Yeah, so I was hoping to make just a very bullet point abbreviated version of the workflow for our seed crop season. And the picture on the right is me taking a spa day. It was one of my little life goals, was to take a bath in fermenting cucumber seed. And so a year ago, when we had enough of it to do, it's very good for your skin. And so that's me relaxing after a hard day of work. And I'm sure every farm has a different flow and a different dynamic. So hopefully I'm not going to gum this up too much, but just walking through the basics of a year on the seed specific tasks. There's almost always something to do, but these are sort of the big ones that I need to make sure I've got time and crew available for. And so starting wherever the beginning is, because everything's circular, but I think of the seed season kicking off, the first things we're doing is replanting our stored biennial roots, our steckling roots. And so that's usually the first thing we get into the ground. For us, that could be March and April. I'm speaking from a Michigan perspective, 6B, if that means anything anymore. And so these are planted around the time when we would plant our peas or maybe transplanted onions, about as soon as the ground can be worked usually. I've done them as early as February, if the weather allows. Then moving forward into April, May, and June, we're growing our seed crops just like we would grow produce crops. If we're a produce farm with a lot of succession planning, I think of the seed crop trying to fit in the best succession for that species. And so like if you're proud to be able to grow lettuce for market, 35 weeks of the year because you've nailed it, what's that best week for your spring lettuce? And that's when I would plant the seed crop for lettuce. And so for us, that would be a late May transplant or a mid-May transplant, and then for an early June harvest. But then the seed crop obviously would bolt and continue growing and not produce seed into maybe late July or August. So then moving forward, the the seed crops that might have felt a lot like you do your produce crops start to differentiate. Your fork in the road is when you start doing your roguing and your thinning. And that for us has usually been May and June, maybe July, depending on the crop. And so this is when you're observing and finding the ones that are true to type, your roguing, but also thinning to your seed spacing. So like with lettuce, for example, if you grow lettuce on 6-inch or 9-inch or whatever, I would thin that down to foot and a half. And instead of like 3 or 4 rows per bed, it'd be like 2 rows per bed. And so a pretty dramatic thinning so that they can get to their seed size. I mentioned July as a break time because if you're primarily the seed specialist on your operation, it can be the leanest time of, I would say, the whole year. It's sort of right after solstice. Everything's planted, everything's thinned, heck, mulch everything if you can do it, but nothing's really seeding yet. There's no real seed harvest. Of course, it's not break time if you have a diverse operation. We'd be doing haymaking, or maybe our garlic's going, the produce is going. But as a seed producer, that's almost an easier break for me than December. Moving on, harvest starts to happen. It creeps on in July, and then like Nathaniel said, it gets real big in August and September, and it can be quite busy. I think of harvest as 2 kind of shapes. Some crops want to be all at once, which is really kind of my preference. Like if it gets, they all mature, they all dry down, you come out with a team and you just knock it out in one action. But some crops prefer to be harvested. Think of them like an indeterminate. We would do lettuce that way. I know people do lettuce all at once, but we would do lettuce where we would go twice a week and shake seed into a bag or a bucket. And we found we got a better yield that way. Some of the flowers, we'd just come in and we'd get it into like a twice a week afternoon chore the seed team would run through. Moving on to October, if I'm on time, which I never am, processing and cleaning, that's like October's the big month. I think Adrianna mentioned that it's a good synergy to use your nursery hoop as a space. Your nursery is usually pretty empty then, and it's a good protected space for seed cleaning, for dry down process. That's when you're making a big chaffy mess into a small chaffy mess, and then eventually clean seed. I like to get my germ test going in November. We always did it in-house. So it's sort of like 3rd grade science project, go napkins and paper towels and counting seeds and doing that whole thing. So if I'm on schedule, November is when I like to do it. And then December is like seed company. So we were doing our own pack sales, our own retail. And so that's when we're doing our inventory, we're updating the website, we're filling packs, we're printing labels, we're contacting the artwork person, we're talking to our retailers, getting people excited. Because January is usually when the retailers wanted to talk to us. Seed sales on the website, which I think is the first way to do it if you're doing your own direct sales. They would start in December, but people want to go home for the holidays and think about things, and then January is we would see those sales ramp up. Sales continue February through April. Really depends on what the world's doing. The COVID year was interesting. The other COVID year was also interesting. Beep, beep, boop, boop, boop. Things start to trickle down when things get warm, I've found, but in May we would get kind of that last impulse buy pack sales. It would really be a good synergy if you do a big plant seedling sale, to have a rack there at market. You're selling all your tomato starts, or you're having a bunch of people over for their flower baskets or whatever. Having a seed rack is nice. And then June, your seed sales are kind of done, and produce is ramping up. So it was already mentioned that from a cash flow perspective, it's almost perfectly opposite your produce cash flow, which can be pretty nice, but it means you never get a break. Apologies if that was fast. Yeah, questions or comments from the other moderators or the other farmers?
Yeah, let's circle through, because I'm sure that there's other considerations to be made when it comes to workflow, because I know you all have different, the right word, your structures of your farms are all quite different.
We have a few more slides that cover this subject and then just a couple other ones. I'm wondering if it would make sense in the last few minutes just to kind of bust through those, and we can kind of hit on it. All three presenters can hit on different points. Does that make sense? Just so I don't have to share my screen multiple times in the last few minutes.
Everyone looks amenable.
Sounds great.
Oh yeah. So I just threw this together. A whole lump of salt. This is just showing the relative kind of amount of time spent in every month for every kind of enterprise on your farm. So we do vegetables, seed contracts, and retail seed, and you can kind of see where the peak months of all three are here. The vegetable kind of ramps up through April and kind of flattens off for us, June through July, and then has another peak in August, and then is still pretty busy in September, but then starts to go down through the winter. The seed contracts kind of follow that same arc, although as Eric said, you can see there is a bigger dip in July. There is that lull there for us where we actually were able to take a 1-week vacation in July this last year and just put our crew managing the farm and running the CSA, and it was totally fine. July has become our kind of little mini winter. And then like the vegetables, they peak up during harvest season for contract growing, and then dip back down as you get all those seeds sent out to the seed companies. With retail seed packets, it's a whole other beast. Our busiest time on the retail business is in December and January, as we're packing seeds and especially getting all like the wholesale orders sent out to the nurseries. And then it just kind of slowly decreases for us down through April until we start to manage those in-field seed crops again for the retail business. And other than that, it kind of follows the summer arc of the contracting, if that makes sense. And as far as just some other synergies that we didn't talk about, we do a lot of variety. Do you want to talk about this, variety trialing?
I don't know, maybe Adrianna has something to say about seasonal workflow.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's do that.
We can pivot back.
I looked at that graphic that you made last night and I was like, that's totally what happened to me last August.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because we are only 3 people on our farm, the seasonal workflow for seed specifically is almost entirely me. So I pull away from the farm or from the veg production element of it, and I'm doing exclusively seed stuff. So I'll be doing like the whole harvest, and I'll pull someone away for a little bit of time, but I'm doing the bulk of the work myself. And that's how we've been able to sort of pare it down. But that, yeah, I mean, it's true that August and September are like the craziest times. There's like melons and there's seeds, and that you're drying stuff and you're still like putting in all of the stuff for fall and winter. We do a year-round farmers market, so that also like, yeah, it just gets kind of crazy. But the way that we've done it is that I'm the only person who's dealing with seed. And you were talking earlier about, someone's out there harvesting peas, but they're actually your pea seed crop. Like that's a really big part of why I'm the only person who does anything with seed and blocking off seed, the seed crops, and just like, this is a seed crop. Don't think about it. It's my thing. And to compartmentalize has been a bit of how we deal with the workflow, is like, it's kind of my responsibility. And yeah, I mean, I think that's all that I have to say about workflow. In terms of trialing, we do a lot of trialing, and we've done, I think I mentioned it earlier, when we've grown varieties for seed on contract for other seed companies, they've turned into varieties that we've incorporated into our vegetable production. So that's like a great pro of growing seed, is just really finding new windows for different plant varieties and like incorporating them into our farm plan in terms of, yeah.
Adrianna, you reminded me a little bit of sort of 2 times of year that because likewise, I was sort of the seed specialist on a diverse farm. And the 2 times a year when my time was, when I sort of had to break away, especially from the crew, was early on when we were doing our nursery work. And I was sort of maintaining the fulfillment of a seed company. And so having another person whose mind was entirely on nursery production was very helpful. And then the full other end of the fall, when I was managing the seed cleaning, was really a time that I had to break away from the crew that was doing that last bit of harvest and even like field and bed prep. And I just remember that kind of fighting for my time. So it's definitely it's helpful to have a specialist. So you've got that in your head and you've got someone else who can shoulder some of the other complexities of the farm those times a year.
Yeah, I think of it as being relevant to like the whole triaging element that's happening on a weekly basis from like, August through November, basically. And just trying to prioritize, like, what of my seed things can I not stop doing this today or tomorrow or before the rain? And then what are the things that I need to get to market that I absolutely cannot forego? And so having one person on it has just been a big part of how we do it.
One other little anecdote I'm thinking about with this seasonal workflow, at least in the Pacific Northwest, being a farmer's market veg operation in conjunction with being a seed farm can be it can be intense in September when rain might appear unexpectedly, unpredicted, and you have to go to farmer's market, but all of a sudden it's starting to drizzle and you have some seed crops that are like completely ripe and ready. And to kind of deal with that, we have a well-trained group of friends who know how overwhelmed we can get, and also just some really good volunteers that we can call on a moment's notice to, split off and get those crops out of the field while also being at farmer's market. And I guess it's been another benefit of separating from farmer's market, having a CSA and a seed company, just, to not have those time constraints of we have to be at market now and we have to get seed crops out now. Those can be difficult priorities to choose from. But that being said, I think it's really wonderful to have both. We truly like it. I don't know if we're selling it or just completely making it seem overwhelming, but it's kept us interested in farming for a decade. Just to have all of this to manage is a lot, but it's also so interesting and fun. And there's just a lot of creativity that can go into all of it when you have all of these different pieces. And it makes farming still incredibly inspiring, I would say. And I don't know if I would feel the same if I had just been growing market veg for a decade, so.
Yeah, I'm seeing a question here. Are these folks aiming on focusing on one or the other? And I would say for us, we have hit a pretty nice little sweet spot where doing the CSA primarily and then the seed primarily, while kind of thinning out the farmer's market and the wholesale veg and the restaurants, which take up a little more time for us. We've just kind of focused on those two enterprises and we've kind of hit a sweet spot. And I think we're going to continue to do both. We found that especially there's a lot of great synergies in doing both that Annie mentioned, but also we do tons of variety trials. And we are always kind of testing as many varieties as we can, trying them out on our CSA customers, see how they like them, and then incorporating kind of our favorites into our seed catalog. And without having a produce outlet for a lot of those trials, I think that would be a lot of wasted food and space. So, I mean, that alone is almost worth it to me, just the joy of having a reason to grow hundreds of varieties every year, not just to look at them, but to be able to feed them to people and then just hopefully some of your favorites also produce good seed in your area as well. One of the other benefits of having seed work and vegetable work is that if you have a crew that you want people to stay on long term and be able to grow with the company, there's just more roles that people can kind of gravitate to and find inspiration in, whether it's seed or vegetable or admin or field management. Just having more space for more people to grow with you and your company and keeping them around long term and full year cycles is really nice for kind of the seasonal workflow of a lot of otherwise farms.
And we're still not quite there to keep another employee on full time in the winter, but at least now we have some wintertime work for, you know, an employee, and every year it's a little bit more. So.
Yeah, before we move into the questions that Kit's been collecting, I'd love to hear from all of our panelists about this question. I think it's a really nice way to end the more formal panel session. So are either of you looking to change your ratio moving forward? I know Eric maybe doesn't know, but I feel like maybe Adrianna, you have an idea about where you're going with this.
Because we've been a 3-person farm, and my bigger passion is seed and my wife's bigger passion is vegetable growing. It works for both of us to have both. The things that are engaging for me in seed are not necessarily engaging for Jolene in seed, and the things that are that to me can sometimes feel monotonous about vegetable growing and going to market and this that sort of routine, I can break up with seed. So for me, I really like doing both. I think a limitation to how we can grow either part of that business really has to do with labor. And but I like this last year where I was really just was able to prioritize seed stuff and pull away from veg to some degree, really like allowed our third person to like sort of rise into more market and into more market responsibilities and more admin responsibilities. And that has really helped in terms of like sharing responsibility, like really creates an incentive I've found for people to want to continue working. They're like driving the things that drive them. So I think what I like about having both is it gives room for all of us to like have our own things that we focus on. So I'm not really trying to move into one or the other. I do really like having them simultaneously. And I think what your point of, you know, growing all of the seed and having to thin and rogue, and then you're just composting that to me is just like heartbreak. And so I'm always really, really thankful when I'm like, this is my seed crop that I'm selling to you today. Like, always feels like such a joy to share also. So I don't really see us going one way or the other. I really like having them simultaneously.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, Eric.
Yeah, so I'm moving away from the farm that I was working on, so I can't sort of speak to the direction that I know we are going, but I love doing both seed and produce, but we'd also have to sort of follow like the economics for our farm. And I believe that seed work has a lot of ways to be more profitable per labor hour or per field space. But I wasn't finding that in practice. I was finding produce to be sort of an easier profit than seed. And I think a lot of that came from the risk with seed. We were getting our crop failure down to pretty rare in produce. But with seed having just sort of a longer life cycle, a crop failure was a lot more common for us. And you know, crop failure can take the form of weather being wrong and the whole thing just obviously like not performing, but also you can get a seed crop to harvest and clean and then have a poor germ result. And that you know, that can be kind of devastating because you've put a lot of effort and time into it. And you don't, like with other aspects of farming, things happen and there was like 700 factors and you're not quite sure what the lesson is. And so, and then there's also the very real marketing aspect of it. And so if you're direct marketing your seed packets and you put that all in your spreadsheet, it can be like incredibly lucrative. And so if you are able to generate that market and to move those packs, like absolutely, bravo. That's gonna be a very good profit margin for most things. Like pencil out cherry tomato seed and pack sales. But if you're not able to generate that market, then you're just going to bottleneck on how much you can move. And then when you look at things in terms of contract pricing, I found the numbers don't equal what I could just do in produce. And so if we do a high value succession greens or almost anything really, we could hit a better dollar. And so we struggled with that. And so seeds did have a lovely percentage of our operation, but I wasn't able to grow that percentage without seeing an economic path. I'm sure that's different farm to farm, but that was my experience.
I little by little we're growing more seed every year just because like Eric said, we're following the economics of things a little, and our seed business is slowly growing, but it hasn't grown to the degree where it could, make enough money to pay ourselves and our employees and, kind of compensate for what we have been doing veggie wise. That being said, even though I see the potential for that in the future, I'm pretty tied to just the social aspect of having a CSA. I'm a social person. And while I do very much love putting on our biology major hats and doing the variety trials and doing all of the extra kind of, rigor that's involved in the fields of understanding how to successfully grow seed crops, you just don't have that personal connection that you do with market customers or CSA members. And being CSA farmers has allowed us, a couple hundred relationships in the community that I'm not really up for letting go. So that feeds a different side of ourselves that's real. And so we're kind of, we're two different people with two different prerogatives, but having both of these businesses side by side is working to kind of scratch the social itch that I have for sure, that Nathaniel has too, and also, keep us stimulated to have, the seed crops as well. So.
I would echo Eric that I feel like contract pricing for seed is not where it needs to be really to really incentivize more people getting into this not just for fun and passion and love of biology and pollinators, but actually to have a profitable farm business. So as you get experience with seed growing, fight for what you need. Maybe do some enterprise budgets and figure out what your average, bed makes with your produce, and make sure you're getting a lot more than that for your seed, because it takes a lot more work. And communicate that to the companies. We try to be pretty responsive to our contract growers about what they need, and sometimes it's just not going to work. But hopefully you can meet in the middle somewhere and really communicate why you need this price, because you don't want to get burn out and realize that head lettuce at the farmer's market is better than growing head seed for lettuce that takes 3 times as long almost. For us, the seed packets, we started off just doing seed racks without any online sales, and that was kind of a labor of love for about 3 years. It was like 10-15% of our income. But once after we kind of hit a little threshold right before the pandemic, and then especially going into the pandemic, where just the name recognition from our racks were feeding a few more online sales, and it became something that we saw being a long-term kind of part of our business, and not just kind of this side hustle that we were doing for fun. And over the past 2 years, it's actually grown to over half of our gross income in seed. So we're pretty much at like 50-50 right now, seed and vegetables. But yeah, at first it was hard to figure out how to make it work. And so if you're not getting that full, $3.50, $4 for a packet, you really have to fight for those good contract prices, I think. And
$5 packet.
That was really helpful. It's so great to be able to hear all these different perspectives and different ways of making this work. It's really nice. So I'm going to pivot us. Kit has been distilling the questions and has it down to one question that will answer all the questions. That might be slightly overselling whatever Kit's going to tell us. But
Buckle up. Here it comes. No, I have a few questions, but I was able to put a few of them together from what I saw coming up in the chat. So thanks to everyone who contributed questions in the chat. One that is on a technical aspect that we didn't get to in the earlier conversations is about dry down and the use of hoop houses and greenhouses. And I know this is something we talked about before, about kind of how you prioritize that valuable real estate. And at the same time, if there are any risks associated with seed viability that come from drying in a covered location, a hoop house, a greenhouse, shed, etc. Yeah, so I'll leave those two parallel questions with you about how you decide how you use that covered space, and also whether you've seen any decrease in germination rates or anything from drying in like a hotter space.
Yeah, so our greenhouses are certainly our seed and vegetable crops are certainly in competition for that premium greenhouse space. The greenhouse space in our climate really comes into handy with some of those really long season seed crops that are kind of mature marginally here outdoors otherwise. So certain flower crops and basil and eggplants, even some of the later lettuces will just do so much better in the greenhouse. So knowing what you can get per ounce or per packet on those seed crops versus what you're going to get otherwise in your heirloom tomatoes growing in that space sold at farmers market is kind of good to weigh. We also have like 3 caterpillar tunnels in production for our vegetables and 1 caterpillar tunnel that's purely designated for post-harvest dry down. And so we don't grow anything in there because we don't want to have it compete or have to kind of deliberate what should move in and out of there. It's just for seed, and we can always know that if we pull something out of the field, there's going to be a covered space for it to do some post ripening. And that's a 125-foot caterpillar that we fill and empty out 3 or 4 times over with tarps before threshing during a given season. And it's totally changed. Before, we were dragging tarps in and out of our barn, our garage, our start house, our front door, like several times a week, depending on moisture and inclement weather. And you don't want to have to deal with that in August and September. Just have a dedicated space where you can post ripen seed crops and keep things dry until they're ready to thresh. It'll give you a lot of peace of mind.
I can go next. I absolutely agree. Having a dedicated space that you can kind of count on, because the getting seeds out of the field can be on their time, not on your time. It sort of feels like haymaking in that way. I've never tried to compete for seed space with a in-soil like season extension hoop house. I've always done our seed cleaning in what was a dedicated nursery space. And so this was like a bench top nursery with nothing growing in soil, either like a landscape fabric or whatever bottom. And so that nursery space was not really being utilized in the fall time of year when seeds are coming in, and that worked pretty well. I've done this both in Colorado and Michigan. I've found that I'm less worried about heat than I am about moisture. And Colorado, moisture was easy because it just didn't happen out there. But in Michigan, man, a cloud can sit on your farm for a month and just not move. And so having that indoor hoop space that you can get your mature seed crop out of that moisture, that everyday dew, is very helpful. I think Edmund was mentioning putting some kind of shade or cover over their hoop. And we've put a shade cloth just over that hoop for that time of year. Almost more for the humans than the seeds, because the humans will melt. And I've also found that investing in good threshing equipment is also helpful for the humans, so that you're not spending so much time in a hot space. If you can thresh something quickly, just so that you don't melt in that hot, dusty space. But yeah, it's very useful to have something prepped, ready, dedicated, so that you can bring a big tarp of stuff in. And then one last thing is, when you're in a very busy space in the growing season, my seed cleaning is usually just as much as I can do to get crops as small as I can so that they're safe and protected. So often that means oh man, this brassica crop is ready and it's got to get out of the moisture. It's huge though, so we're going to cut it, move it on a big tarp, put it in there, and then we're waiting on crew time to do that first thresh, to shrink it down. So instead of being a tarp that takes up half the hoop, it's a few bins. And then I like to get things to a place where I don't have to worry about them so much. If they're cleaned enough that I'm not worried about moisture, rather than it's this big chaffy mess that who knows what kind of mouse house is going on there, or what's dripping in it, or what kind of scary things could happen. And so that's sort of as my paranoia and our available labor balance out.
I was going to say I do something similar to Eric in terms of we only use our propagation greenhouse for drying and turning the big pile into a smaller pile. And that's really useful. We will cycle a bunch of seed crops. What has been really beneficial and is a shared infrastructure investment is we have heat tables. So if there's something that still has some moisture that I'm just trying to harvest ahead of a rain or something like that, I will put it on the hot tables. Or if I harvest it and another element that I will sometimes do is we have a big shade cover for our greenhouse that is 20 feet wider than the actual house. And so we've started expanding that off to one side of the house and sort of keeping stuff in the shade, keeping it cool. But that's only as long as it's dry outside. Once it gets wet, I need to move it into the greenhouse. But if I have the opportunity to turn a big chaff pile into a smaller thing and move that into the house, then I'm in a better position. So yeah, I try to get it into as small a space as I possibly can, as quickly as I can. But I do have that house is really open. It kind of pushes me to get all of my props out and onto a hardening space out earlier sometimes, but mostly they're not competing with each other, and I'm able to get all of my drying and all of my seeds out of the weather ahead of time. So yeah, and that's a benefit of having the farm having had prioritized vegetable production in the beginning, is we have this really big propagation space. So that's been really beneficial to us.
One more quick thought, the ventilation fans for air circulation that are very helpful for a nursery are also very helpful for drying down your seed lots. So it's another point of synergy, I guess.
I have one more question that I think is a quick one that I found here in the chat, that is about knowing if there's any restrictions around the varieties that you want to grow for sale, seed varieties. So if, for example, if there's an OP that you really like, can you just basically start growing seed of any OP that you're interested in, open pollinated variety? Or is there more of a process that you go through to try to understand what's available, or if there's any royalty agreements or restrictions related to a certain variety? And I want to note that we have 2 minutes left, so we might just have to hear from one of you. Sorry to be a teaser, but I'll turn it over. Eric, you seemed ready. Oh, Nathaniel, Annie, you seemed ready.
I can say something really, really quickly.
Sure.
I grow seeds on contract, and I think that that's one of the ways in which that whole element is simplified. I agreed wholeheartedly with what Nathaniel was saying earlier about, I don't think contract actually makes as much money as doing retail sales and packet sales. But the complexities that you're giving up is kind of like the trade-off of it. So that's what I'll say.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot to say on this subject. Just because it's open pollinated doesn't mean it doesn't have intellectual property attached to it. There are utility patents that are becoming more and more common in some of the bigger national catalogs, and they aren't necessarily advertised in the catalog. You kind of have to do some research. They're not necessarily all recorded in one spot either. We've grown a couple lettuces and that we thought were just open pollinated, but then had utility patent. So we couldn't sell those. Generally though, the older kind of household name heirloom varieties are mostly open community property at this point. So if you're shopping at a kind of a local, regional, smaller seed company, most of those things are going to be fair game for saving seed and even selling your own packets yourself. But there is it. I can't even think of it right now. Do you remember? Grin. Yeah, it has some of it. But yeah, there's PVPs, which allow you to save seed, but not sell it commercially. And there's utility patents that will prevent you from even saving seed on it legally. So knowing what kind of intellectual property is attached even to an open pollinated variety is important before you start to saving seed on it, absolutely. But yeah, Erica wrote the USDA GRIN PVP search is what we use for PVPs to find out for the plant variety protection. The utility patents are a little trickier. We generally end up doing like a Google search with the variety and just trying to find as much information about it as possible if we suspect there's a utility patent attached to it. If anybody else wants to share resources for finding utility patent lists, that'd be very helpful. Good question.
Yeah.
I was wrong about the amount of time we have, so other folks, please feel free to jump in.
I would just say that it's a very big topic and not one that I have a lot of expertise on. I've generally grown older heirloom varieties that I felt pretty confident about. I also would kind of divide the subject between like, is there some kind of like law or someone's trying to prevent you from growing seed? I'm not sure why. Or is this about paying respects? And so those are very different topics. And the paying respects, I think, is very important, and to acknowledge where that seed came from and its history as best you're able. And then there's, if someone's trying to just say, well, this is mine, I personally object to that, because that just feels very small and arrogant. And I would say, well, grow it anyway and to heck with them. But that's not legal advice. Especially, it's, I don't know. I struggle with someone pretending that they can own something in that way. Anyway, yeah, older heirloom varieties. I guess I don't know too much more than that.
Thank you. Another question came through in the chat about contracting relationships and kind of any tips or experience that you have from having grown on contract with seed companies in the past. What have been sort of helpful approaches that you've taken to developing or maintaining those relationships, or what have you found frustrating that you want to learn from or share with other folks without naming names about how to maintain those relationships with your contract customers.
I'll say something. I think this, I think Deep Harvest was talking about this a little bit earlier, and trying to be as transparent as you can be about the contract price that you're getting. There's times that it hasn't worked for me, that I put more in than what I've actually gotten out. And it's hard to know as a person who was like, I want to grow seed. So I think the, I guess most direct path to doing that is doing seed contracts. It kind of feels like an easy way to step into it. And in a lot of those interactions, I feel like I didn't have as much information as I needed to have. And so I've learned a lot. And now and one of the things that I've learned is how to say no, that there is a point at which it's not worth it, that I really need to value my time. So yeah, I think to try to be transparent, I communicate with the people that I'm on contract with pretty regularly. And just and keeping track of how much time I'm putting into it, how much effort is going into it. Did I need to make more infrastructure investments to make that seed contract possible? And communicating all of that. Other times it's been super great and I gotten a seed contract and it's gone swimmingly, and I just and it was exactly what I wanted to when I got into seed contracting. I've been really thankful for all of the seed companies that we've worked with. I feel like they all took a chance on me because I was like, hey, I've grown seed. I want to do it. Will you help me develop this skill as a grower? And there's also a value to that. So that's also really important, and I want to honor that. I have been learning a lot as I've been growing on seed contracts. And the value of that, I can't exactly quantify the way that I can about like my time and infrastructure investments that I've made. So I feel like it's up and down, and it depends on the crop. And if you don't know what you're getting into, don't commit to that much seed of a seed contract. I definitely had, especially after the 2020 seed rush that happened, I had a lot of people asking me like, can you grow more? Can you grow 10 times the amount? And I really needed to think about, like, does this actually multiply? Does the labor and infrastructure and all of that stuff multiply out 10 times and equal what I need it to be, or am I just going to be burnt out? So I think like really being clear with yourself and really communicating your needs with who you're working with is like a really important element to it. And I would say in my first year, I was really afraid to say anything. I was like, no, I'm going to do it all and it's going to be great and I'm not going to fail you. And now I realize it's a different kind of relationship, and they need contract growers as much as I need a contract. So we need each other, and it's really important to just get that into perspective as you go in. So communicating and like honoring yourself and honoring like what they're putting into you as well. So I think that's what I have to say.
Just from a starter perspective, a lot of times some of the smaller seed companies will offer greater price per pound. Sometimes we've seen as much as double, just because they're focusing on packet sales instead of sales to farmers, and their calculations are just different. And so I think for folks getting into seed growing for the first time, growing on contract is a good way versus just launching into retail packet sales, because you have the resource of the seed company to draw on when you have questions. They're often experts and can guide you in your growing pursuits. And working with the smaller company, you're not going to launch into humongous contracts at first, but that can be good as you're kind of just getting your seed growing chops, and you'll get a greater price per pound, and not kind of get in maybe possibly over what you can do as you're learning. So.
Yeah, and I would just say that more communication, the better. If anything comes up, there's a disease introduction or a kind of a weather thing that's putting your harvest and yield goals in doubt, just communicate that as early as possible with the with the company, they should be pretty responsive and hopefully have some tips. And it's a pretty understanding community. We all realize that nature happens, and the more communication and humanity that you can share, the more forgiveness and understanding with the company and the contract grower. So yeah, just keep it an ongoing conversation. We all get really busy in the summer, but at least a couple check-ins per season at minimum is good.
I would add that coming up with harvest yield metrics for seed crops can be more challenging than with produce. So trying to start soft so that you can learn what's reasonable for your farm, for that crop, for that variety, and then keeping as best you can records. I try to maintain, what was the field spacing I use, like what was the population or a useful equivalent metric that got me that yield. And even in that, like, for example, I was looking at an onion seed crop that was grown in the same method, the same spacing. And in one year, my notes were like, pretty good, but yield seemed low. And it was a successful crop, good germ. And then in the last year, it just was an incredible harvest. It was a 10-fold increase of seed yield per field space. And these were both successful crops in terms of germination and vigor. And so just as an example of how variable it'll be, and I couldn't tell you what was different about those seasons. And so coming up with that, like that economics, obviously the latter one was much more economical than the former. I find that to be really challenging for coming up with contracts.
Great, thank you. In the last bit of time here, I want to recognize that there are probably a lot of people who are listening in who have also been growing for market, growing produce for market, and growing seed at the same time. I just on a quick scan, I saw a few folks, and so I want to invite others who have insights onto some of the questions that have been asked, or if you just want to share a little bit about some of the kind of going back to how we started the conversation, the pros and cons, what you love about growing both seed and vegetables together, and what you find challenging. It'd be great to hear some other voices. If anybody wants to speak, you can either raise a hand, or what might be easier is to just put in the chat that you have something to say, and I can call on you. In the meantime, there was a question for a little more information on the heat table you mentioned, Adrianna, about what your heat table setup looks like. I think that came from Lori. Is that something you can describe for us quickly while we're seeing if anybody else wants to chime in?
Yeah, so we have a heat table that we use a propane hot water heater for. It's a 50-gallon propane hot water heater. And then we use spaghetti tubing on the layers of the table is basically the metal top, spaghetti tubing that is like right up against the metal top. And then within the frame of that, we have insulation underneath it that drains out on one side. So that kind of makes sure that the heat is actually rising up on the table instead of just going wherever it wants to go. And yeah, we'll basically just lay down the seed crop right on top of the table, and it's just on like really mild heat. We have a thermometer that goes with it, and the between the hot water heater and the spaghetti tubing, there's a recirculating pump so that the hot water is like recirculating through the spaghetti tubing. It's pretty basic. I think that Josh Volk has a design in his building farm tools that is very similar to what we built, and it has like a supplies list. But something that we started doing this year, which I really, really, really loved, is we set up a pellet stove inside of our propagation space. And so that keeps it warm all night. And that's really great for when like we're having humidity in the evening times, like in the fall, keeping stuff crisp. till I can get to processing it. And so that's not exactly like a hot table, but it's a way of keeping the space really, really dry and making sure that the seed stays crisp until I can get to that, project or whatever. So those are the two ways that I deal with seed in the propagation space.
Great, thank you. I saw Kelly chimed in the chat saying that you could share a little bit about your farm transition from produce to seed. We'd love to hear. We've got just 2 minutes left, so it'll be a quick one.
So I'm Kelly and this is Russell, and we farm in Moscow, Idaho. We farm veggies for 20 years and then have been transitioning to seed production. And part of, I think ultimately we'll probably be all seed. Right now we're about a third veg, a third veggie seed, and a third garlic seed, and garlic. And I think ultimately we'll be seed growers because of the sort of awesome schedule that it provides, and like managing both, you can see from the flow charts and all of it, is that it's really intense and year round. And as we age, I think it's offering us an opportunity to stay scaled up in our production, but cutting out the farmers markets and just that weekly boomerang of marketing has been really great. So yeah. Do you have anything?
Oh, and it's cool just to learn something new. And
yeah, it's kept it fresh because we're learning a whole new set of skills, but also, and we're still farming and we're still going to the market. We go to, I don't know, 16 markets a year, but that's down from previous. So
Did I miss, can I ask, are you growing on contract or direct sales, or how are you doing your seed sales?
So we got really lucky and got invited into the Snake River Seed Co-op as they were starting. And so 100% of our seeds at this time go to the Snake River Seed Co-op. We grow about 35 varieties of things. But probably what will happen is as we phase out the veggie production, that will become contract growing. That's what we see it, because we're sort of topped out. Like, I think we have what we can get from the Snake River Seed Co-op. Because it's a group of growers, and you want to have a big group of growers involved in the co-op, so you don't want to like take too many crops and squeeze people out. So yeah, I think we'll probably pursue contract growing. I mean, the relationships with the farm, like we had a CSA and we had a farmers market stand, and it's hard to sever those relationships. But also our quality of life has gone way up. We have, it's really nice. We have a really, after years and years of just working straight through the summer, no days off and long days and all of it, we feel that transition, and it's cool. And our income has gone down somewhat, but we're also able to, totally support ourselves still.
That's great. It's a very visual appreciation. Yes. And to all of our speakers, thank you. The panel was great. I feel like this was a perfect group of people to really encapsulate a lot of really interesting experiences and to bring a lot of enthusiasm into this work. And I'm sure that folks that are just deciding whether or not to move in the direction of seed felt really encouraged by all of your information. And also by the cautionary notes. I think that was great. And many thanks to everyone for participating in the chat. There's a lot of great resources that got dropped in there. So if you want to save that chat and go back through it, there's wonderful information in there. So thanks everyone. We have to wrap it up, but this was really wonderful. And I hope everybody got exactly what you needed from it. And thanks again, Kit, for setting this up, making sure that everybody came super prepared. So
I'm sure everyone can, folks can reach out to all of us too, I'm sure. Don't know these folks well, but I think that we're all pretty open books. So feel free to shoot us all emails.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Yep, you can find all of our speakers. I'll tag them all in a post on Seed Commons, so look for that. And then if you want to follow up with everybody, with anyone individually, that will be available.